this might look like in terms of assessment. Now, I'd made a couple of notes reading through some of the comments you'd put on the VVox poll, for example. Many of you had noted comments, the fact that you liked Curriculum for Wales because it was quite a flexible curriculum. People had put comments along the lines of it enables students of all abilities to access learning. However, there were also some comments, for example, maybe differentiation might not enable all learners to show their potential properly. And Maxine was talking about as well some of the rigidity that we find in particular relation to aspects of this. And I'm just going to start this off by linking back to a quote that one of the groups put on the Padlet last year, which has made me think a lot since then. And in particular in relation to differentiation and assessment. And one of the groups last year, I think they were from a secondary school setting, put this point onto the Padlet, which I thought was quite informative. We do a lot to support learners throughout their schooling, but when it comes to the end of school, they then face uninclusive standardised examinations and assessment. This, to me, seems to undermine all that good work that we've put in place beforehand. So when we think about assessment, this can be quite a contentious area. Weymouth back in 2008 cautioned, for example, results from high-stakes summative tests can have negative effects and impacts upon learners. However, Earle in 2013 suggested that if we do assessment right, whatever we mean by that, then student achievement can be raised through assessment. Now, thinking about external summative exams like GCSEs and A-levels, every year we put some of our learners through reasonable adjustments, for example. So putting things in place that do not alter the level of an assessment, but offer additional support for those who might need it as a result of a learning disability or disability to access these assessments without offering an unfair advantage. So things like extra time, use of a laptop, having a scribe or an oral language modifier. Some literature does suggest, though, in the spirit of inclusion, is there a case for considering how we offer assessments to all learners rather than how we can provide reasonable adjustments to some learners to overcome the inherent barriers within such assessment? So for those of you who might have had a chance to look at some of the materials on PLP, there was a resource, as Meg noted earlier, from the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, looking at key actions for raising achievement and offered guidance, in particular relation to assessment, notably thinking about the importance of assessments being authentic, that assessments support learners to develop skills, knowledge, understanding, and potentially using assessment approaches that help learners prepare for life and work after education as well. They also highlighted the need to think not only about what we assess, but also why we assess it, how we assess it, and what the information we gain from that assessment is subsequently used for. So just as we consider differentiated curriculum content and delivery with Meg this morning, learners may also differ in the ways in which that they can best express their competence and understanding. Therefore, there is no single means of expression or assessment that will provide all learners with valid, equitable, potentially opportunities to demonstrate this learning. So I'm just going to skip a few parts of my notes, conscious of time. So if the purpose of assessment, as suggested by Garfield's 1994, for example, is to support or enhance learning, then it's worth noting that some 25 years ago, the Assessment Reform Group suggested that there is no evidence that increasing the amount of testing alone does enhance student learning. William, 2008, like Weymouth, also discussed the impact of high-stakes summative assessment, particularly upon how they could negatively affect students in terms of self-esteem, progression opportunities, and life chances. Earle, that I mentioned a few moments ago, asked us to consider about what the purpose of the assessment is and what we do with that data, and what type of data is particularly gathered. So is it quantifiable data? Is it qualitative data? What do we do and use this type of data for? And they go on to suggest, for example, data can be used in various ways, for example, to consider learner progress and achievement, or to assess the effectiveness of teaching or an intervention, and potentially for setting meaningful targets for learners. Now, when we think about many settings, it is common that many learners across different settings, especially when they're engaging with some form of additional or targeted support or intervention, this might be done through a kind of being withdrawn from the classroom approach. Kelly and Phillips, when they talk about the golden rule of intervention, for example, suggest that any learner who engages with intervention, especially if it is in a withdrawn format, should make more progress than what they would have done if they'd stayed in their everyday classroom doing their everyday activities. Otherwise, the logistics around that movement aren't really worth it for the learner. So potentially some of the data we might think about in our assessments could look to inform how we deliver and monitoring the impact of assessment, of intervention, as well as assessing summatively what students know. When we think about types of assessment, then we might be thinking about formative assessment. So it's important to consider not just how we assess, but to ensure meaningful engagement with learners with feedback and feed forward. An assessment might help to ensure consistency in terms of capturing progress from a wide range of evidence sources. Can we have the next slide, please, Meg? Thank you. Can we go back one slide, please, Meg? William, thank you, in 2011 talked about the fact that when we're thinking about assessment, we can distinguish between assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. Now, when we think about assessment of learning, this might involve looking at assessment information at the end of teaching and learning processes. It's typically summative in nature and often involves standardised testing. And these scores are often used to rank students' achievement levels against a particular standard, potentially to move learners between different groups or to evaluate the results of specific tests. The effectiveness of these assessments for grading depends heavily upon the validity and reliability of the tests used, in addition to such tests where we use these to diagnostically assess learners. So, for example, assessing learners diagnostically for dyslexia. One of the tests we might use is the CTOP2, the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Awareness. Now, this is a test that measures a learner's phonological processing ability, for example, the ability to recognise and manipulate sounds. And looking at the manual that supports this test, it asks the assessor to grade the learner's performance in terms of how deviant it is from the norm, which I think is interesting in terms of the terminology that's used. Now, when we think what is the norm that we are comparing people's assessment on that tool, for example, this was a tool that was published in 2013. It's an American assessment tool. The normative population was 1,900 people aged 4 to 24 who were taught in a different education system in a different country, using potentially different types of pedagogy. So when we are assessing learners against some of these standardised tools, is it appropriate, for example, that we are testing a 12-year-old in Haverfordwest or Holyhead or Welshpool in 2025 using this tool? Are we comparing like for like against these normative samples? Assessment for learning, on the other hand, then is an approach that generates feedback that students can use to improve their performance. And from a teacher's perspective, this could be as simple as observing classroom discussions, asking questions, or reviewing students' work as they progress through modules or courses. Assessment for learning might also be part of diagnostic assessment, which informs intervention and support for learners. And there is perhaps a wider range of data that we might be gathering, including portfolios, observations, anecdotal conversations, as well as those standardised types of tools. And finally, although it's not on this slide, William also talked about assessment as learning, and they noted that this occurs when students work as their own assessors. In other words, they have opportunities to monitor their own learning, ask questions, and then use a range of strategies to decide what they know, what they can do, and how to assess that in practice. So however we conceptualise a conduct assessment, I'm sure we can all agree that it is a powerful and impactful process, and it does have the potential to either optimise or inhibit learning depending upon how we do it. Can we have the next slide, please, Meg? So we're just going to ask you shortly to go into a final breakout room, and you can see another QR code to a Padlet on the slide, and the Padlet link is also in the chat at the moment as well. So in this final Padlet activity, we're going to give you 10 minutes. That might mean we don't have time to take formal kind of verbal feedback when we come back, but those Padlets will remain in place moving throughout the module that you can refer back to. But for your final discussion for this morning, what we'd like you to think a little bit is about what assessment looks like in your setting, and in particular, assessment of learning and assessment for learning. So in your setting, how do you do assessment of learning? How do you do assessment for learning? We'd also like you to think a little bit about whether any of the assessment types or processes that you use lead to barriers to learning. So for all learners generally, or maybe ALN learners more specifically. And we'd like you to think a little bit about how these barriers could be overcome. And trying to finish on a positive point in terms of the session, it would be really interesting to hear back from any of you where you think the assessment processes that you use actually work as facilitators of inclusion. So what is it that you do in terms of assessment that facilitates and underpins inclusion? And thinking about those things that you do, how might we be able to embed or disseminate those practices more widely? So I'm going to stop talking shortly. I'm going to ask Christina if you're able to open the breakout rooms for us, please. It's 11:19. We're going to come back at 11:28.